Thank you for joining me for this informal, relaxed time together. We've started to look at Paul's very first letter to a group of people who were scattered over a broad region. It would be like Paul writing to all of the people who were followers of Christ in the state of Florida. So the letter would be passed from one church to the next, family to family. They wouldn't necessarily know one another, but they would know Paul. And Paul is upset. Paul is probably more upset with this group of people than anybody else. They were some of his first converts, and he is unable to go visit them. So he writes his letter and expresses shock. That's right. He uses the word thaumazo, which is a word exclusively used to display some type of amazement, shock, depending on the context. And a couple of things have happened since he has come to them and proclaimed the good news of Jesus. They, both Jew and Gentile, had then been followed up with by another group of professing believers who proclaimed to them a Judaistic gospel, a gospel that seemed to be tinted with requirements that came from the Jewish law, from the heart of Judaism, the Ten Commandments, religious rites, things like circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, and they began to slip away and began to believe things which were contrary to what Paul had taught and proclaimed to them. In addition, his own apostleship, his authority to speak for Jesus, was called into question. They knew about his background. He alludes to that in chapter 1. But this letter opens up like no other letter. You'll never see him begin addressing people in the manner that he does in this book called Galatians. And then, as I will show you in just a minute, sometimes Paul writes and gives us a key. This is the key to my 71 Mustang Mach 1. This is for the ignition, and this is for the trunk. Back in the day, the round key with the round head indicated that was for the trunk, and the more square version of the key was what allowed you to put that in the ignition and turn it on. Paul gives us a key to what the remaining portion of his epistle will be occasionally. Now, when John writes, sometimes he saves the key to the last. he says, come on in, but he doesn't give you the key to the door until the end of the epistle. He does that in his gospel, in chapter 20, at the end of the chapter, and then in his first epistle in John's gospel, he sort of tells us along the way why he is writing and gives us his set of keys. Paul does it right at the first in verse 11 and verse 12. But I'll get you a taste of the shock that Paul felt when he discovered, probably through a representative that came to Paul, he expresses his shock and he says, I'm shocked that you are so quickly deserting. That's a word using or to describe a military deserter who deserts his post and deserts the army. Deserting the one who called you, deserting the Father or Christ who called you by the grace of Christ, and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. There's only one gospel. And apparently people are throwing them into confusion and trying to infiltrate and pervert the gospel of Christ with some Judaistic tendencies. And then he makes some of the most shocking statements of all Scripture. And he says it twice for emphasis. Anytime you see something repeated, that means, I want to emphasize what I'm having to say, and I want you people, please, to pay attention, because this is serious. He says, even if I or an angel from heaven should proclaim a gospel other than the one that we proclaim to you, let him be damned to hell. Let him be anathema. There's no worse no worse sentence passed on a person than to be anathema. It's to be doomed. It's to be condemned. And then in order to make his case, he says, as we have already said, we and the people who are writing this epistle with him, so now I say again, if anybody, even the angel Moroni, if that kind of an individual comes and proclaims a new gospel, other than the one that was what you accepted and embraced, let that person, let that man, let that woman, even let that group be anathema. Let him be damned. And he goes on to ask some questions which will make his case and provide some credibility. Am I trying to win the approval of people or the approval of God? When I say what I do, and throughout this warning, whose approval am I trying to get? Certainly not people. Paul was not fearful of people. He was not a people pleaser. He didn't care if he stepped on toes. He didn't care if he upset people. And he did. Like Jesus, he was ready to rebuke people in their faults, their failures, and especially when they diverted from the gospel that Jesus accomplished for us at Calvary. He continues on with questions. He says, am I now trying to please people? Well, of course not. Not when you say what you do. If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. But that tells us where his loyalty was. It was absolutely to Christ and no one else. And that's a remarkable change in Paul's life when he will tell us here that in his former way of life, he had a reputation. He was an abuser and an antagonist of the gospel. He did not support Christ. He, in fact, tried to destroy the church, as he will say a little bit later on in this same epistle. But then he comes to basically what is his proposition for the entire gospel. This is the key. Verse 11 and 12 is the statement which encapsulates and opens the door to all of the book of Galatians. So here's Paul giving us a key to open the door to the whole book. If you memorize this verse, these two verses, and understand what Paul is saying, carefully observing the text, observing each word, you then can march into the pathways of Galatians, each chapter, and it all ties back to these two verses. There's something he wants them to know, and this is it. He says, I want you to know, you as a congregation, you as a group of people who have once followed Jesus, I want you to know, not to feel, but to use your mind, to think. I want you to know something. Brothers and sisters, making sure that he covers everyone, that the good news I preached, or the good news I proclaimed, is not something invented by human beings. That's the statement, isn't it? That the New Testament, as we find it explained and written by Paul, is not a message whose origins are found somewhere in a brilliant man or a brilliant woman. The gospel, as we call it, finds its origin, finds its ultimate source somewhere else. But he wants them to know that what he proclaimed to them at the beginning and they received is not something that man created or a woman created or invented who is brilliant and an intellectual. This is not some new wrinkle that blew through the culture. He clarifies, I did not receive it from any human being. That's a pretty powerful statement. I did not receive it from any human being. That's quite a claim, isn't it? That's quite a claim. Nor was I taught it. Someone did not come into Paul's life and teach him the good news of Jesus. He's unique. That's how we depended on it. We were recipients of the good news from somebody who taught us. A member of our family, our father, our mother, maybe a Sunday school teacher, a youth group leader, someone in our neighborhood at a good news club. Someone was the means by which we heard the good news of Jesus, not Paul. We don't hear him talking about how his parents were the ones who showed him the good news of Christ. Instead, he says, rather, I received it. It's the second time he used that word. I didn't receive it from any man, but I received it by revelation of Jesus Christ. Notice, observe. The good news that I had proclaimed to you. Where's the origin of that message? Where did I find that message? It found me. Jesus Christ revealed it to him. Jesus Christ intervened into his life, broke through the space-time barrier, and introduced him to the good news about himself, about Jesus. He received it by revelation of Jesus. That means that Paul had a choice. Go out and proclaim what he had heard directly from Jesus, or keep quiet. But Jesus had commissioned him to go to Gentiles. He had to cross over our cultural barrier as a Jewish man and proclaim what he had heard directly from Jesus. So there was no chance that human beings got in and interfered and changed it and messed it up and took away proportions of the law or elements of the law that were supposed to be in there. No, he got it from Jesus. He got it from Messiah. He got it from the Jewish Messiah, the Jewish king, the one who had died and was buried and rose and ascended back up to Mount Eden, back up to paradise. Paul's confidence in his gospel was where it came from its origin, its roots, its source. It's pure, it's undiluted, it's not stained by human beings, it's not stained by a denomination or by tradition, by the tradition of the elders. This gospel came to him directly, a direct pipeline from Jesus to Paul. That's unique, but that's why he's an apostle. He witnessed the resurrected Christ in Acts 9 on the Damascus Road, and he repeated that story twice in Acts 22 and Acts 26. Now this passage he will defend for the rest of the book, especially in chapter 1 and 2 of Galatians. He's going to show in each paragraph, and you can follow it, how it was impossible in his early years after salvation to have received the gospel from people, or for people to have got into his life and changed the message and messed it up and added this ingredient and added that ingredient. He's going to show by his own personal life that there was no time, there was no opportunity for anybody else to come in and add elements to the gospel he received from Jesus. That's his point. And so over the next few days or week, what you can do is go to each paragraph in chapters 1 and 2, and you'll see that how each paragraph shows clearly at different phases of his life that no one came in and interfered. No one came in and added a few cups of this and a few cups of that to the ingredients of the good news of Jesus. Paul got it directly from Jesus, and that's how he received it, and that's exactly what he proclaimed to them. So they have a choice. Wow. If that's what Paul got from Jesus, and we've changed, if Paul's message came directly from Jesus, and we've changed what we believe, we've changed to a different form of a gospel, then the fault doesn't lie with Paul. The fault lies with us, and we need to go back to the drawing board. We need to go back and figure out what it is that Paul has been saying. And in Galatians 3 and 4, he explains further what he means by the good news of Jesus, and it's a message about what justification means. Justification by faith in Christ alone. So that's where we're headed. Thanks for stepping in for a few minutes, for giving me your attention. I look forward to seeing all of you again on Sunday, coming up for another exposition from Luke. And one special note that we can all look forward to is one of our young ladies from our kids club is going to be teaching us from one of the books of the Old Testament what she's observed in the text. Be praying for that little girl. I'm looking forward to hearing her. I'm proud of her family, her support, the support that she's received from her family, and of course from all the kids in our kids club. I miss all of you. I look forward to being with you again to dive back into observation, interpretation, and application.